The desert was swallowing villages, rivers ran dry, and hope was fading. But one man refused to surrender. Ibrahim Traoré dared the impossible, planting 5 million vines to fight back the sands of Burkina Faso. What he did next would shock the world. Watch closely, because this is a story of courage, betrayal, and a miracle in the making. If you believe in hope, in resilience, and in the power of one person to change the world, make sure to like this video, share it with everyone, and subscribe to witness more incredible stories like this. The desert was not silent. It groaned like an ancient beast, swallowing villages grain by grain, creeping forward with a patience that mocked human time. Once fertile fields now cracked open like broken skin, and the wind carried not only sand but the taste of despair. In the dying light of evening, families watched their homes vanish beneath dunes, their wells choking dry. For them, there was no future, only survival measured in sips of muddy water and handfuls of grain. Ibrahim Traoré stood at the edge of this ruin, boots half buried in shifting sand, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the earth seemed to dissolve into nothingness. He carried no weapons, no armies at his back, only a vision so radical that even his closest allies whispered doubts when he was not listening. 5 million vines, stretching across the land like a living wall, roots clawing at the desert to hold it back. It sounded absurd, it sounded impossible, but to him, it was the only answer left. Behind him, whispers carried through the corridors of power. Foreign bankers and corporate men in dark suits spoke his name with disdain, calling him reckless, naive, a dreamer doomed to fail. They had offered him deals before, genetically modified seeds, contracts for land that would feed corporations, not his people. He refused everyone. In boardrooms far from Burkina Faso, decisions were being made, decisions that would starve millions if his vision stood in their way. And in the shadows closer to home, others waited. A silent opposition, born not of foreign ambition but of hunger for power. They watched him plant hope in soil that had forgotten how to drink rain, and they smiled bitterly. The desert was not the only enemy. Children with ribs, showing like cages of bone, gathered around the first vines, their tiny fingers touching the fragile leaves as if they were treasures. Mothers with hollow eyes prayed that roots would find water before their children wasted away. Soldiers grumbled in the barracks, torn between loyalty to the young captain who defied empires and the promises of those who offered coin and comfort if they betrayed him. The air grew heavier with each passing week. Crops withered faster, storms grew harsher, and caravans bringing saplings were ambushed or burned before they reached the fields. People began to whisper that the desert itself had declared war on Ibrahim Traoré, but he did not yield. Night after night, when the stars stretched endless above the barren land, he walked among the vines, whispering to them as if they could hear, his hand brushing over leaves that trembled in the wind. He carried in his chest a weight greater than the storm, greater than the doubt, greater than the whispers of betrayal. He carried the hope of a nation, and then came the ultimatum. A letter slid under his door, unsigned but heavy with menace. It was not the desert that spoke now, but men with power and money. They demanded he abandon the project, or the cost would not be measured in plants, but in lives. He read it in silence, the candlelight trembling across his face. Outside, the desert howled louder, as if laughing. What he did next shocked the world. The morning sun rose like a burning coin above Burkina Faso, spilling its harsh light over a land that had grown weary of promises. Ibrahim Traoré awoke before dawn, as he often did, not because sleep was foreign to him, but because the silence before the heat was the only time he could think clearly. His country stood at a crossroads. To one side, the sands devoured everything. To the other, the foreign creditors who spoke the language of gold and contracts rather than human life. He remembered his youth in Kaya, where elders once spoke of rivers that ran freely and fields that breathed green even in the dry months. Now those rivers were bones of stone, their beds filled with dust. He thought of Sankara, the man who once dreamed of greening the Sahel, and how bullets silenced him before his vision could take root. In the long nights, Traoré sometimes wondered if he was walking the same path toward an inevitable betrayal. If the vines he planted would become his tombstone rather than his legacy, the city of Ouagadougou was restless. At its markets, women whispered about hunger and rumors of famine spreading from the north. In the barracks, young soldiers shifted uneasily, their loyalty divided. And in villas hidden behind tall walls, 3 men gathered over wine and whispered plans of their own. They were generals, veterans of old wars, their uniforms pressed sharp, their hearts colder still. Each had once fought beside him, but now they looked at him with envy and calculation. They knew his obsession with vines would either make him a legend or a fool, and they were willing to ensure the latter. Foreign agents came too, dressed as diplomats with polite smiles masking sharp intent. They carried charts and graphs, projections that spoke of efficiency and sustainability, words that sounded noble but hid an empire's hunger for land. They urged him to sell his gold reserves to the IMF, to trade away sovereignty in exchange for temporary relief. They dangled promises of foreign aid, aircraft shipments of grain, contracts that would bind the country for generations. Every time Traoré shook his head, every refusal earned him another enemy. But outside the circles of power, the land itself told the harshest story. Villages emptied as people walked for days in search of water. Mothers pressed dry breasts to the mouths of infants, tears cutting lines in faces long since hardened. Dust storms swallowed herds of cattle, leaving only bones scattered across the desert floor. In the north, children collapsed in classrooms where teachers no longer had the strength to stand. The desert was not coming. The desert was already here. Yet in the midst of despair, the first shoots of hope rose timidly from the earth. Rows of vines, small and fragile, stretched across barren soil. Farmers bent low to nurture them, carrying water in cracked calabashes, whispering prayers that the plants would take root. For many, it was less about survival and more about defiance. Planting a vine against a desert felt like throwing a stone at the ocean. And yet each stone mattered. Not all believed. In the cafes of Ouagadougou, intellectuals mocked the plan, calling it naive, a dream fit for poets, not soldiers. Some claimed he had lost touch with reality, that a nation needed guns and gold, not green walls. Others, far darker, suggested that if the vines succeeded, it would mean the death of their own ambitions. Sabotage became common. Trucks carrying seedlings were found overturned, their cargo burned to ash. Irrigation lines were cut under the cover of night. Farmers who joined the project woke to find their wells poisoned. Fear spread quicker than faith, and many abandoned the fields. Convinced that forces greater than themselves, foreign, political, even supernatural, wanted the vines to fail. In the midst of chaos, an old Tuareg elder appeared in Ouagadougou. His skin was weathered by centuries of sun, his voice a whisper carried by the wind. He spoke of an ancient prophecy, a time when the desert would be pushed back not by steel or war, but by a wall of green stretching across Africa. He called it the Wall of Life. Many laughed at him, but Traoré listened. Not because he believed in prophecy, but because he saw in the elder's eyes the same fire he carried in his own. The belief that the impossible was worth fighting for. The weight on his shoulders grew heavier. Letters arrived daily, some pleading, some threatening. Mothers begged him to focus on food aid rather than vines. Generals demanded more weapons, not plants. Foreign powers warned of sanctions if he continued to resist their terms. He knew that whichever path he chose, lives would be lost. In his office, late at night, he stared at maps of the Sahel, his hand tracing the line where vines would one day stretch. He imagined them growing, tangling together, roots clawing into the dry soil, holding it against the winds. He imagined children laughing in the shade of green walls, where once there had been only death. And yet, for every image of hope, another came of betrayal, of graves dug shallow in sand, of his own name erased from history. The storm was gathering. Already the desert winds carried more than sand. They carried whispers of rebellion, of conspiracy, of betrayal close enough to touch. The generals sharpened their knives in silence. The IMF prepared its chains, and the people waited, some in faith, others in fear. And still, Ibrahim Traoré planted vines. The winds grew colder, sharper, as if the desert itself were testing him. By midday, the sand whipped across the plains like a living force, filling eyes, mouths, and lungs. Yet Ibrahim Traoré moved steadily, boots crunching over hardened earth, hands brushing tender vines that shivered in the gale. Every root that held firm felt like a small victory, every leaf that remained green a rebellion against the barren expanse. But victory was fragile. Supply lines had been cut again. Wagons carrying saplings were ambushed, their contents dumped into burning pits. Farmers who had pledged their loyalty vanished without explanation, leaving the soil empty and the air thick with suspicion. The generals had not yet moved openly, but the signs were everywhere. Whispered threats, sudden orders reversed, communications intercepted. Traoré felt the sting of betrayal not in a single blow, but in 1,000 subtle cuts, each one testing his resolve. And then came the spies. Foreign agents moved like shadows across villages, offering bribes to anyone who would report on the progress of the project. A young scientist, a quiet genius who had helped design irrigation systems capable of channeling scarce water into the thirsty earth, disappeared one night, leaving behind a note scrawled in haste. Trust no one. Traoré felt the weight of the warning as he crouched beside a row of trembling vines. The desert had been relentless, but human treachery was proving just as dangerous. Children still came, drawn to the promise of green. Their laughter rang like a fragile bell through the storm, mingling with the cries of mothers who clutched infants in their arms, praying that these small shoots could survive the wrath of sun, sand, and man. Soldiers who had once mocked the plan now stood in quiet observation, unsure whether they should defend the fields or join the whispers of conspiracy that crept like poison through the barracks. One evening, under a sky bruised purple with the dying sun, an old Tuareg elder appeared again. He led Traoré to a hidden valley where faint, cracked channels of water ran under layers of sand, remnants of an ancient irrigation system long forgotten. The elder's eyes glinted with a knowledge that bordered on the mystical. "Here lies the secret of survival," he murmured. "If you can awaken it, the desert can be held at bay." Traoré traced the channels with his fingers, heart pounding. This discovery could change everything, but it was not without danger. The generals had spies nearby. Any movement could alert them, and yet here was a lifeline hidden beneath the desolation, a whisper of hope where there had been only despair. As he returned to the city, news of sabotage reached him in waves. A convoy carrying vital water pumps had been set aflame. A storage warehouse of saplings was found emptied in the night. Even as enemies struck from outside, whispers of betrayal from within became louder. One trusted aide had been secretly funneling resources to rival factions, his loyalty bought with gold. The sting of it cut deeper than the desert sun. Rain threatened to fall, sudden and unrelenting. Storm clouds gathered over the plains, a rare blessing with the potential to either nurture or destroy. Traoré faced a terrible choice. Risk planting the remaining vines in the storm, exposing them to ruin, or delay and allow the desert to claim even more ground. Every moment of hesitation carried consequences measured in lives lost. In a daring move, he gathered farmers, children, and soldiers alike, urging them into the fields. Together they battled wind and rain, sinking hands into mud to plant every remaining vine. Every fallen seedling was rescued, every young plant coaxed into the earth. The storm became a crucible, testing resolve, loyalty, and courage in equal measure. At night, after the skies cleared, he surveyed the fragile rows of green trembling in the breeze. Some had survived, some had not. Yet even in failure there was promise. A stubborn defiance in the face of annihilation. And somewhere in the city, the generals watched, their envy and fear coiling tighter with each success. They had underestimated him, underestimated the strength of a man who would plant hope even when every force sought to destroy it. Traoré could feel the tides turning. The desert still raged, the conspiracies still whispered, but the first signs of resilience appeared in the soil. A single vine had rooted deep enough to survive. Another followed, and then another, like tiny flags planted in defiance. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in months, the faintest glimmer of triumph broke through the suffocating haze of sand and fear. And yet, Even as hope began to sprout, shadows lingered close. More betrayals awaited revelation. More storms threatened to undo all progress. The desert was patient, and the enemies of the vision were relentless. Traoré knew that only through courage, ingenuity, and unwavering faith could he hope to turn the tide completely. The vines were no longer just plants. They were a symbol, a weapon, a promise. And the world had yet to see the full force of what Ibrahim Traoré was willing to risk to save his land. The storm arrived without warning, a living wall of wind and dust, roaring across the plains like the anger of 1,000 years. The sky, once pale and forgiving, had darkened to a bruised black, lightning stabbing through the clouds in violent bursts. Rain fell in sheets, thin at first, then pounding, tearing at the fragile leaves of the young vines. Traoré stood at the forefront, boots sinking into mud, face slick with water and sweat, eyes fixed on the trembling shoots that seemed so small, so fragile against the fury of nature itself. Around him, farmers struggled, bracing themselves against the tempest, clutching seedlings as if they were children. Soldiers who had doubted now fought beside them, hands raw, backs aching, but unwavering. Even children, eyes wide and terrified, pressed close, carrying buckets of water to roots that were already soaked and bleeding from the storm. Each step, each act of planting, felt like a defiance of death itself. From the shadows of the city, the generals watched, their hands clenched on railings, teeth grinding. They had anticipated failure, the destruction of the plants before they took root, and yet, the sight of Traoré's unwavering stance sparked a rage deeper than they expected. They tried to intervene through agents, sending men into the storm to sabotage the fields, but even as they struck, the resilience of those who had taken up his cause held firm. Lightning illuminated secrets buried in the earth. As Traoré dug trenches to channel the rainwater to the rows of vines, a hidden network of ancient irrigation channels revealed itself beneath the mud, remnants of a forgotten civilization. Precise, cunning, almost miraculous in its design. He traced the lines with his hands, realizing that this gift from the past, unnoticed for centuries, could save the plants if he acted quickly. Every drop of rain was redirected, funneled into the thirsty roots like liquid gold, yet treachery lurked close. One of Traoré's most trusted aides revealed a hidden allegiance to the generals, attempting to sabotage the channels by diverting water away from the fields. The betrayal came suddenly, a knife in the back during the height of chaos. Traoré reacted instinctively, intercepting the diversion, confronting the aide with the calm fury of a man who had already stared death and ruin in the face. The aide fled, swallowed by the storm, leaving behind only whispers of regret and fear. As night fell, the storm did not relent. The desert had arrived in full fury, sand mixing with rain, mud becoming quicksand beneath the feet of those who dared to fight. Vines bent under the pressure, some breaking, others clinging with astonishing tenacity. Every inch of survival was a battle, every sprout a triumph against not only nature but human treachery. Then came a moment of quiet in the eye of the storm, a pause that felt sacred. Traoré surveyed the fields, counting the leaves still standing, tracing the channels of water he had redirected. For a fleeting instant, it seemed impossible that anything would survive. Yet he saw it, the smallest vine, green and steadfast, its roots buried deep in the rediscovered channels. Holding fast, as if it knew that the fate of the land depended on it, it was a miracle born of persistence, courage, and relentless faith. In the storm's fury, he saw a pattern. Where the earth had been touched by care, by devotion, it responded. The desert, vast and merciless, had met its match in human determination, and ancient knowledge awakened. The generals, watching from a distance, could only gape in disbelief. Their plots had failed, their bribes, their threats, their manipulations, all rendered useless by the unity and bravery of those who had refused to yield. The storm began to wane, leaving behind mud-slicked but living rows of vines, each one a testament to the audacity of a man who refused to bow to the desert or to power. Traoré fell to his knees in the mud, exhausted, drenched, but alive. Around him, the farmers, soldiers, and children raised their hands in unison, their eyes bright with tears and triumph. The desert had not been defeated, not entirely. But for the first time in decades, life had pushed back. Green shoots carving hope into the sand. And somewhere, hidden in the folds of the land, the prophecy whispered true. The wall of life, once myth, had begun to take form. Fragile, yet unyielding. Traoré's vision, daring as it had seemed, was no longer just a plan. It was a movement. A rebellion against the sands. Against despair. Against betrayal. As dawn broke, washing the plains in pale light, the first glimmers of green stretched like a promise across the horizon. The world, watching from afar, could scarcely believe it. A man, a few hundred loyal souls, and 5 million vines had turned a corner of the earth back toward life. And in the quiet that followed, Ibrahim Traoré looked out across the land, feeling the pulse of possibility for the first time. The desert had tested him, tried to break him, but he had endured. And now, the world held its breath, wondering how far this audacious fight could reach. The desert still whispered its threats, but its roar had softened, tamed by something it had never encountered before: determination. Across Burkina Faso, vines reached skyward, their leaves shimmering in the sunlight as if celebrating survival. Villages once on the brink of abandonment now pulsed with life. Wells that had long been dry carried water once more, fed by channels rediscovered and renewed under Traoré's guidance. The land was far from healed, but it had begun to breathe again. Farmers who had once walked aimlessly across barren plains now tended fields with hands calloused by hope rather than despair. Children chased one another through rows of green, laughter ringing in the air where only wind and sorrow had existed. Mothers, who had feared the endless hunger of their infants, now whispered prayers of gratitude rather than desperation. Soldiers who had doubted Traoré's vision walked the fields with pride, realizing that loyalty to a dream could be more powerful than loyalty to orders or fear. News of the success traveled fast. International banks and corporations who had sought to control or undermine the project were left humiliated. Their maps and charts could not predict what human will combined with faith in the earth could achieve. Traoré's defiance had not only saved his country, but had shown the world that hope could take root where greed had once ruled. Across the Sahel, neighboring nations watched in awe as the first green shoots of a revolution emerged from the sand. Scholars and scientists traveled to Burkina Faso to study the reclaimed land. Young activists spoke of the Vine Revolution, inspired by a leader who refused compromise in the face of impossible odds. Stories of Traoré's daring spread like wildfire, a man who had stared down the desert, betrayal and hunger, and had refused to bow. The old Tuareg elder returned, smiling faintly as he traced the paths of the water channels. "The land remembers," he said softly, "and so do its people. You have awakened something older than fear." Traoré, kneeling in mud, brushed his hands over the young leaves, feeling the pulse of life beneath his fingertips. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. And for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future where the desert would shrink, where villages would thrive, where Africa could rise. The generals who had plotted against him were exposed, their schemes unraveling in the face of undeniable proof. Their threats lost all power. And the people, witnessing both the courage and the persistence of one man, began to rise in their own ways, planting trees, restoring canals, building communities not dependent on distant powers, but on their own hands. Traoré walked the fields at dawn, the horizon painted with gold and green. Every vine was a story, every leaf a testament to resilience, every root a symbol of resistance. The desert had been challenged, and though it would continue its slow, patient advance, it would never again claim these lands without a fight. And across Africa, whispers grew louder, carried from village to city to nation. If one man could dare to plant 5 million vines against a desert, what might a continent dare to achieve together? The question hung in the air like a promise, stirring hearts. Planting ideas as potent as any seed, Ibrahim Traoré stood tall amidst the rows of thriving vines, wind brushing through his hair, eyes scanning the endless horizon. The desert had tested him, betrayed him, threatened him, but in the end, it had yielded, not entirely, but enough to show that courage, vision, and faith could tip the balance. And in that moment, as sunlight kissed the green leaves and laughter echoed across once barren plains, a single truth became clear. The world had witnessed not just a man's audacity, but the awakening of a land and a people who refused to surrender. If hope could take root here, it could take root anywhere. The question lingered, soft but insistent. If one man could challenge a desert, what could an entire continent do? The answer, whispered by the wind through the vines, seemed to answer itself. Anything.